And thanks for everybody who's joining us this evening. So I'm going to jump straight in to give you some major points about the cult and then go into explore certain aspects in a bit more detail. So first off, membership of the Cult of Mithras is male only. We don't have any evidence of women being allowed to join the cult at all. In order to join the cult, you had to undergo an initiation ceremony. You couldn't just walk in off the street into a temple to Mithras and join in. You had to be initiated into the cult. And the initiations and pretty much all, from what we can discern, activities conducted by the Cult of Mithras would take place behind closed doors inside of their temples, which had no windows as well. So, I mean, it's called the Mysteries of Mithras for a reason, and it was a quite secretive cult. One of the issues that we have in terms of, though, trying to recreate what a lot of the cult involved, as say, there's no public aspects to it. There's no public processions, there's no public festivals, and trying to understand what a Mithraic initiate believed or what sort of rituals they partook in is quite difficult because we don't have any texts from the cult as such. We have nothing of the equivalent of the Bible, of the Quran, for the Cult of Mithras, and there might never actually been any textual, any sort of book or anything like that, central text that the cult had. So we're very reliant on archaeological evidence from the temples to Mithras that survive, from the iconography, the carved reliefs, the paintings, and inscriptions as well. And we do have textual evidence that comes from external sources to the cult, other sort of pagan, you might say, authors who were interested in religion and ritual practices in the Roman world, and people like Porphyry, who's a 3rd century philosopher, talked about the Cult of Mithras. He wasn't a member, but he's got some interesting information. And we have authors from the 4th century onwards, Christian authors who, although hostile to the cult, do give us some information that appears to correlate with evidence that we find in the archaeological record. And as I say, because these people are external to the cult, we have to take it with a pinch of salt, but there is stuff there that clearly does have a measure of truth to it, or a measure of accuracy to it. And so the earliest evidence that we have for the cult dates to the late 1st century AD. It appears to actually originate out of Italy itself. The earliest inscriptions and Mithraic temples actually appear up on the northern frontiers, particularly close to the Rhine, but they seem to relate to soldiers in particular that have moved out from Italy. And we have the poet Statius in the late 1st century as well, who talks about the cult in his poetry. So it seems to be that the cult's probably come into being at some point in the 1st century, and Statius was living in Italy, and so to say, it seems to actually start in Italy and then spread out from there. And evidence for the cult stretches across the whole Roman Empire, from Hadrian's Wall up across to the deserts of Syria, but it's far more concentrated in the western half of the Roman Empire, particularly in the likes along the frontier regions, along the Danube and Rhine rivers, and also in Rome itself and its nearby port of Ostia. As I say, we do have evidence from the likes of Egypt and Syria and North Africa, but it's not in abundance. It really is mainly seemingly a Western phenomenon. And so, as some of you, see why we're drink. As some of you will probably be aware, there is a deity in Persia who had existed for a number of centuries before the Roman Cult of Mithras came into being. His name is Mitra, so he has a very similar name to Mithras. He eventually becomes part of the Zoroastrian pantheon. Zoroastrianism becomes the major religion of the Sasanian Empire, which in the kind of about the late 3rd century onwards becomes a big rival to Rome. And some of you might be aware that Zoroastrianism actually carries on to this day. So there might be somebody watching right now who is part of the Zoroastrian religion. So hello. Mitra, though, he, along with having a very similar name to Mithras, looks quite a lot like the Roman Mithras. He's a young man wearing a tunic, He's got this conical cap going on that sometimes flips forward at the top, like Mithras in his what we call a Phrygian cap. And like the Roman Mithras, he's also connected to the sun. He's a deity related to the sun. But the thing is that Mithras is not Mitra directly imported. That doesn't seem to be the case. I'll go into these aspects about the Roman cult in more detail in a bit, but things like Mithras being depicted with a bull, the particular architectural style of Roman Mithraic temples, the seeming grade structure that the Roman cult's hierarchy has, none of these things really seem to exist in the Persian worship of Mitra. So at some point, this image of Mitra gets combined with these other things and creates the Roman cult. Where does this occur and when does it occur? Well, we don't really know, so we don't have any text, so it makes it even harder to discern. It seems quite likely that perhaps one major connection is in what is now southeastern Turkey. In the 1st century AD, you had the kingdom of Kommagene. The rulers of Kommagene worshipped a number of deities, but Mitra seems to have been quite prominent amongst them. The image you can see on the left of your screen comes from a large monument from the kingdom of Kommagene, a colossal head of Mithras. But in the course of the 1st century, Kommagene is annexed by the Roman Empire. The last king of Kommagene moves from his now former kingdom to Rome and spends the rest of his life there, essentially in retirement. And the kings of Kommagene as well seem to combine Mitra with a sort of interest in astronomy, and astronomy does play, astrological symbolism plays quite an important role in the Roman cult of Mithras. So the image of Mitra and astronomical interests combine seemingly under their rule. The last king moves to Rome, and it's probably in his circle that the seeds of the Roman cult are planted. But where all this other stuff gets added in is difficult to discern. But as I say, it does seem to originate out from Italy, so that seemingly makes sense. And so, as I mentioned, the central image of the Roman cult is Mithras depicted with a bull. And this image, much like Jesus on the cross or crucifix in general, you'd see in any church nowadays, any Mithraium that you could have got access to in the Roman world would have had this image of Mithras with the bull inside of it. And Mithras is depicted astride the bull. He's got a dagger that he's plunging into the shoulder of the bull. Traditionally, we say that he's sacrificing the bull, although it's been brought into question whether or not this is really the case, because as you can see, the dagger's going into its shoulder. So if you want to sacrifice it, it seems a bit of an odd way to go about doing it. But this image of Mithras and the bull, those two figures would always be there. They're often depicted with an array of other characters as well, and this can vary, and I'll show some variations in a moment. There's usually several animals, at least, that are depicted in this scene. A dog and a snake who feast on the bull's blood as it comes from the wound. A scorpion which grabs the bull by its testicles, so regardless if the bull's being sacrificed or not, it's not coming out of this situation well. And then above Mithras, up in the right-hand corner of the relief, which is well displayed by this image from Austria, is Sol, who's personification of the sun. And between the two of them is a raven, who seems to act as a kind of messenger between them. The relationship between Sol and Mithras is a bit it's a bit difficult to describe, partly because, again, it's not overly clear. They're often depicted as being separate entities, but Mithras is also called the unconquerable sun, so they are separate figures, but seemingly also can combine. It's, again, so I'm not going to go into the nuance of it now. I'm not sure if you can see this given the fact of how the names on the side come up on my screen, but hopefully you can. Above Mithras, above the bull and the top, what would be the right-hand corner, is an image of Luna, who's the personification of the moon. And then either side of Mithras and the bull, you have the two torchbearers, Cautes with his torch up and Counterpartes with his torch down, and they both look a bit like mini Mithrases, you could say. And this whole scene is often depicted as taking place inside of a cave, which again, in this painted scene from Austria, I suppose it's important to remember that these scenes would have been painted and very bright, but you can see a kind of rocky top to it, which is indicating it's taking place inside of a cave. Also in this image, you can see other smaller reliefs around the outside, things like Mithras being born from the rock, and sometimes he's depicted shooting an arrow into a rock and water comes out. These scenes, we don't quite know how they will fit together. There's probably some sort of narrative there, and they tend to be a bit piecemeal in how they appear. I'm not going to go into that now, but it's just worth acknowledging. And so what does this mean then? What does this image though mean if it turns up time and time and again? The short answer is we don't know. But again, through interpretation and various analyses, people have come up with various hypotheses as to what it means. One is the possible victory of light over dark. As I say, Mithras is equated with the sun. The bull is the symbol of the moon and appears under Luna, the personification of the moon. And as Mithras grabs the head of the bull as well, he pulls its body into a crescent moon shape. So, and you also have the two torchbearers who seemingly symbolize dusk and dawn. So there is a lot of implications here regarding light and dark, day and night, etc. So that certainly seems to be part of it. Possibly an astrological significance. Astrology, I've already mentioned, it does play an important role in the cult. And it's been suggested that the figures perhaps represent star signs. The torchbearer is a Gemini, the bull is Taurus, the dog is Canis, the scorpion Scorpio, etc., etc. And also as well, where you have the cave is often talked about in ancient texts as being representative of the universe, because like the universe, a cave has an interior but no real exterior. Ideally it's spherical in shape, and so the cave itself also has kind of astrological implications in that regard, and that will also relate to when I talk about the structures of the temple. And then finally as well, you also have possibly birth or rebirth, as the animals that are feasting on the blood and the seed of the bull, clearly drawing on its life force in some way. The bull's tail sometimes depicts grapevines or wheat coming out of it, suggesting it's got this particularly potent life force to it, and it's giving life. And as I say, with the cave as well, being possibly representing the universe, it could mean that this is the birth of the universe or a new phase of the universe's existence. But as I say, the reality is we don't know exactly, and we might never ever know exactly. And I think perhaps really it's a case of all these meanings and more probably existed to people. It's much like now modern religious image, or pretty much any image, will have different meanings to people. It will affect people in different ways, and I think that's probably what went on in the cult of Mithras as well. Different people took away different meanings from this image, and we kind of see that inferred in the variation in the Mithraic image that appears across the Roman Empire of Mithras with the bull. You have the small one there from London on the left-hand side of the screen, which wouldn't have been the main bull stabbing scene from London, because there are fragments of a larger sculpture. So these things could actually be represented as a standing sculpture. It doesn't have to be a relief. As I say, I don't know, it might be hidden behind my face, but there's a sculpture from Rome on the far right hand side of your screen, which gives you an indication of what that might have been like. Also as well, you have in the middle of the screen a relief from Carnuntum, and I mean this image doesn't do it justice, but this is massive. It's like 1.5 times life size, well, depending on how big Mithras would be, I don't know, but it's a very big relief. It is very, very big, and these things could be quite tremendous in size, and also at the same time very, very small. You also have an example there from Aquileia, which I've included. It's now in a museum in Vienna. I've included it because it's just one of my favorites, and it's just amazingly well carved. And then in the middle, you have these images, one from Budapest on the lower portion of the screen, where Mithras looks quite tired or sad. I don't know how better to describe it, not particularly happy. And then above that, you have this image from what is now Bosnia. This image I only have a grainy photo of. I don't actually know where this relief is now, but it's a very odd one. It's probably from quite late in the cult's timeline, its existence, but the two torchbearers have their torches down. The snake is the only animal, and it has a halo. And Luna and the moon looking, Luna and Sol looking very unimpressed, are kind of squashed into one corner. So, frankly, Lord knows what's going on with this one. But as I say, the materials, the style, the region, and probably the meaning as well, what it meant to people, are going to affect how it's represented. And as over time we see the cult spread and go through a number of centuries actually of existence, we can see increasing variation in the execution of this central image. And so moving to the temples of Mithras, where you'd find this relief. So these temples from the outside would not look particularly impressive. They're not particularly large. They probably only hold up to about 50 people at a max a lot of the times. Most of the time, probably actually smaller than that. But as you entered into a Mithraeum, you'd come into an anteroom, possibly be maybe up to several anterooms before you get to an inner chamber. And this inner chamber would pretty much be the same in every Mithraeum. It would have a central aisle, be flanked by two parallel benches, and at the far end you'd have the image of Mithras and the bull, perhaps behind a curtain or inside a cupboard, and in front of that maybe some altars as well. As I said earlier, there's no windows, so it would be very dark. It would be lit by oil lamps and candles. It would be somewhat atmospheric, I suppose. And there's evidence for the interiors of Mithraea being decorated to look like caves, using wattle and daub to create a kind of semi-circular ceiling on the inside, and kind of making the walls look like you're inside of a cave as well, very rocky. And I mean, this is an extrapolation. This is we know this because more than anything in Italy, they are literally referred to as caves in inscriptions. So this clearly was the intention. So why are they trying to recreate the feeling of being in a cave? Well, one, as I said earlier, is that you have the cave in which Mithras is depicted with the bull, so it's clearly trying to replicate that. But also, as I was talking about earlier, in the cave being a representation of the universe, Roger Beck, in his study of Mithraic temples, their iconography and their structure, Roger has suggested that the layout of all the symbols and the benches, the nave, etc., is designed actually to create a star map, as though you stand in the middle of the Mithraeum, or at least its inner chamber, and you stand in the middle of the universe, and as you walk across, you're walking across the universe. And this kind of links into, as I'll talk about in a moment, particular ritual practice as well. But as I say, it seems to have quite, again, strong astrological symbolism related to it. So how would one be initiated into the cult of Mithras? Well, from what we can discern from some external descriptions, but particularly surviving frescoes inside of Mithraea that seem to depict these events, an initiate would be stripped naked. They would be blindfolded, have their hands bound behind their back, brought before the father, the head of the community, and there they would be tested. They've got a blindfold on, so for them in a dark room anyway, it's absolutely pitch black. So whether or not what they think is going on, we don't know. But they believe they would be tested in some way, perhaps having a torch waved in their face, or a sword, or a bow and arrow, and there'd probably be all kind of chanting going on around them as well, and smell of incense, and it would be very emotional, and it would be very intense, and it's clearly about putting your trust in the people around you and reinforcing those social bonds between Mithraic worshippers. And at some point, the Mithraic initiate would pretend to die. This great find from a Mithraeum in Germany, at Rigel, shows a sword that's like a Halloween sword that would go around your midsection and make it look like you've been run through. So you pretend to die, and then maybe with the Mithraeum recreating the universe, you kind of move around the universe before returning to your body. It's the movement of the soul. And then at the kind of apex of the ceremony, the blindfold is pulled away, and then you see the image of Mithras and the ball, the curtain or the cupboard open, pulled back, whatever, and it's there shining light, probably with a candle or a lamp behind it. But when you think you've not been able to see anything at all for God knows how long, suddenly burst of light in your face, this kind of image of Mithras and the bull. It would be quite, as I say, intense and probably very mystical. I would say it's a kind of coming to Jesus moment, but that would be slightly misleading, but you get my drift. It would seem like almost perhaps a divine revelation. And so when you join a Mithraic community, you're probably assigned a grade. Saint Jerome, a Christian author from the 4th century, tells us that there were 7 Mithraic grades, and we have this mosaic from a Mithraeum in Ostia, which depicts items seemingly related to each of the grades. So the father is the top grade, the raven is the lowest grade. And in terms of inscriptions, the father, obviously as the head of the community, is one of the graves that's most frequently referenced. But funnily enough, the lying grade, which is the middle grade, is actually perhaps the most secondly commonly referenced grade. And that seems to be because most people, perhaps if they join the cult, would enter at a lower grade, but only manage to get so far up the ladder and they would be stopped, because the upper grades were probably held for people of higher secular status. Because what you can't have is you can't have a centurion lower grade than necessarily a rank and file soldier, or a slave who's a father when a free citizen is a raven. That won't do. You have to keep those Roman social norms as they are. So probably for most people, they can only make their way so far up the ladder, and then the elites or relative to them would come in and perhaps join at a slightly higher grade. Now, we don't know, much like saying the variation in the Mithraic relief, we don't know if the grade system is active in every single Mithraic congregation or community. Probably in some form it is, but whether or not it has all 7 grades or if it's done in a slightly different way, we don't know. But the structure does seem to be an important facet of the cult. So who is being initiated into the cult of Mithras? Well, I've mentioned already, it's popular up on the frontiers with soldiers, customs officials as well. You can see how small groups that have to meet inside of these small temples go through these in-depth initiations. They're all male. You can see how this appeals to these very male-centric groups. Customs officials as well would be groups of imperial slaves. But over time, it does spread to civilian communities. We see merchants and other groups forming their own Mithraic communities, and eventually even senatorial families in Rome by the 4th century create their own Mithraic communities. Now, we don't have any substantial evidence for any emperors joining the cult. In the late 3rd century, the Tetrarchic emperors, who are essentially a group of emperors that run the empire, set up an altar to Mithras, saying he's the protector of their imperium, but there's no evidence they really joined the cult. This is more to do with them appealing to the soldiers up on the frontier, a place called Carnuntum in particular, and showing that Mithras is on our side, even if we're not part of the cult. He supports us, so please don't revolt against us, essentially is the message. Other rituals that are involved in the cult, well, other than initiations, probably a lot of feasting, probably a lot of drinking as well. Feasting seems to involve mainly the consumption of chicken and young pig. So it's basically like a kind of mystical Nando's in some respects. We have evidence for the individual sacrifice of birds as well, where they deposited just the skeleton in a vessel of some sorts. There's no evidence for bulls being sacrificed. You couldn't really fit a bull into most Mithraic temples, which again perhaps alludes to the fact that Mithras isn't actually sacrificing the bull in the main image. And also, as well, they probably would have engaged in some sort of procession across the Mithraeum. Again, going back to the work of Roger Beck, Rogers looked at this vessel that hopefully, as you can see on the screen, maybe it's obscured slightly, but a vessel from Mainz in Germany, which seems to depict an initiation ceremony on one side and this procession on the other side. And the procession, he's hypothesized, is what he calls the procession of the sun runner, which is the second highest grade and is the grade that's really connected to the sun. And essentially the sun runner who holds the sun runner grades, he moves across the Mithraeum, probably accompanied by one person essentially as Cautes and one as counterpartes, the dawn and dusk, as the sun would move across the sky to the Roman eye. So he's moving, the sun is moving across the universe, and that's being replicated in their procession down the Mithraic aisle. But the feasting was probably the most important part. So where does the cult, how does the cult come to an end? When does it come to an end? Evidence that the cult of Mithras ceases in the early 5th century. Often its disappearance has been connected to the rise of Christianity. Constantine, first Christian emperor, comes to the throne in early 4th century, and then Theodosius, towards the end of the 4th century, makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And there is some evidence for Christian desecration of Mithraic temples, but it's very few and far between and difficult to trace archaeologically. What I think more likely is the case, though, and the reason the cult ceases to exist, and it's kind of important here to distinguish between the organized cult of Mithras and the individual worship of Mithras. The individual worship of Mithras probably carries on, I think, but is difficult to trace. We're talking about the organized cult with the attributes that we've seen. And I think that comes to an end because essentially it thrives in this social milieu of the Roman Empire, particularly in certain groups like the military, customs officials, groups of household slaves, etc. Once the Western Roman Empire, which across the 4th and into the 5th century, particularly in the 5th century, is essentially unraveling. You know, it's not falling apart, but we're seeing the rise of successor states. We're seeing some major changes socially, economically, and politically. And I think really that is the circumstances in which the cult flourishes essentially disappears, and that's why the cult basically itself disappears. There is evidence of perhaps attempts to, at least some Mithraic groups seem to transform in their ritual activity, maybe become more accessible, dropping of coins in front of Mithraic reliefs, this sort of thing we perhaps haven't seen before, but it doesn't seem to last very long, and the cult doesn't really survive in this form for a particularly long time. And as I say, by certainly the mid-5th century, the latest, it seems to have disappeared. And then just to end here, I think it's just interesting to note the fact that for some reason the cult of Mithras, as much as it feels to academics like me in our very niche topics, it does actually seem to be a topic that has always had a much broader attraction for the general public. And Thomas More, the Chancellor of Henry VIII, some of you might be aware, wrote a book called Utopia. It's a philosophical work in which a group of islanders worship a deity called Mithra. And it's interesting because More actually lived in a house that was situated above the London Mithraeum. So whether or not he knew he was sat above a Mithraeum, perhaps when he was writing that, we don't know. But it's an interesting little connection there. But perhaps I think one of the people that is really brought the cult of Mithras to a wider audience was Rudyard Kipling. In the early 20th century, Kipling's Puck of Pook's Hill, with its Mithras worshipping centurion Parnesius, would have been read by tremendous numbers of people. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature the year after it was published. And then actually a big Kipling fan, Rosemary Sutcliffe, her books about Roman Britain, The Eagle of the Night being the most famous, has Mithraic worshippers quite often as central characters. And then as a dovetail into the next event connected with the Mithraic on the 14th of May next week. Caroline Lawrence, with her time travel diaries, has the Mithraic as a portal to the past. And as I say, yeah, it's a cult that keeps on seemingly having a broader appeal to people. It seems to maintain interest, which is good for me because we do things like this. So, thanks very much.